Soundcast.
This is a Village Soundcast Network original production.
Welcome to Lends Me Your Ears. I'm Stephen Cook, arts reporter for the Chronicle Herald here in Halifax.
I'm Carsten Knox, a blogger at Flaw in the Iris at halifaxbloggers.ca, and the movie guru at CTV Morning Live.
This is a movie podcast where we look at some current films and then examine some older titles that might be tangentially related, and hopefully you'll learn something about some films you might not have seen before. In the wake of St. Patrick's Day, we saw the Belfast set thriller 71 and decided it'd be a good opportunity to take a look at the legacy of Ireland in cinema.
So this week we went to see 71. It's a new thriller set in Northern Ireland, and it is directed by Jan de Mange and written by Gregory Burke, and I apologize if I'm totally butchering these people's names. Basically, it's set in the early 70s in Belfast, and a young British soldier played by Jack O'Connell, who I guess we saw last suffering mightily through Unbroken. He's Gary Hook, and he is in Her Majesty's military, and he gets posted to Northern Ireland, which he figures should be okay because he's still sticking around the UK, as he tells all his family, I'm not going out of the country. But he finds things to be very different than he expected, and he's really sort of out of his depth when he arrives, and so are all of his fellow soldiers, and they get stuck in a riot in the rougher areas of Belfast, and he gets lost behind the enemy lines, if you want to sort of look at it that way.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense look at Belfast, a divided city, at a time just before things really got bad with the infamous Bloody Sunday incident that took place. I'm trying to remember what the final notes say that happened within months of the events that we see transpire in this film. That that things became really pitched, and then the IRA kind of went into overdrive. This is when things were still kind of on a low boil in the city, and things were tense, but not necessarily in the way that we've come to understand the Northern Ireland conflict at that time with the bombings and everything that happened in the years following that central point. It's although oddly enough not filmed in Ireland.
Yeah, that is interesting. They chose to shoot in Sheffield or industrial UK for standing in for Belfast of the era, but it certainly has that feeling from what I've seen of the city in film anyway, and certainly that sort of yellow, gray, brown, orange kind of vibe that forever will say the 70s, but also the row houses and the graffiti and all of that it feels very authentic.
Yeah, I like your use of behind enemy lines, but instead of being in a distant country or on a far off battlefield, it's a city where everybody speaks the same language, has this kind of a shared heritage of sorts, and it's kind of the same religion if you just think of them as being Christianity or Christians or whatever, but just that one Protestant versus Catholic thing just seems to be the wedge that doesn't get extracted for another couple of decades. And there's still tensions, of course, but it's just hard to wrap your brain around. Even the Canada English divide, or the French English divide in our country doesn't seem nearly as extreme as the divide here over religion. And yet, the cultural differences are so minor, and yet it's that one sticking point that just wreaked havoc in that country for so long.
Yeah, and certainly, the history of British occupation, people being very unhappy and then impoverished on top of that. I think what makes this film pretty interesting is that we have our way into the film through the experience of this young soldier, but he's kind of a cipher. He doesn't really he has very few lines of dialogue. He's really kind of on the run the whole time. He's kind of a living MacGuffin that everybody wants him. And what we find is we learn about the politics and the various factions through the experience of all these other characters in the movie, all these Protestants and Catholics and young and old in the Irish Republican factions. There is sort of the older, more mellow, more willing to negotiate and compromise, and then there's a younger, more hardcore, more violent group, and they all, of course, want this soldier who's trying to hide out in this rougher area. The whole thing takes place over about 16 hours, so it's super tense and a great thriller. Not really a slow burn kind of political thriller. This is actually like more of an action movie, I think.
It kind of is. It ramps. I mean, it's not based on a true incident or anything like that. But the people who see this, who lived there at the time or lived through this, will probably see some very familiar kind of notes that they'll recall from the fact that you're trying to live your life in the midst of all this chaos and armored cars in the streets and soldiers pointing guns at your head, looking for your identity papers on a regular basis and all that kind of thing. It's and yet we think of it as not the sort of thing that happens in what we call the Western world. But here's this island in the Atlantic between us and England. It's not that far away. It doesn't take that long to fly there, and yet it seems like a million miles away in that sense. But the film, the politics obviously play into it, and I guess that makes it feel a little deeper than if it was just a guy on the run from some mobsters, like say the new Liam Neeson movie. So it has a certain depth and complexity that the material, if it had been set somewhere else or just had slightly different plot mechanics, wouldn't feel as meaningful as it does here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I really love the sense of place and the sense of mood and all of it. I mean, it was a real white knuckler experience, and I hope people get to check it out. I know it's an independent film, but I think people would really enjoy it if they gave it a chance. Yeah,
I love how it handles the complexity of the situation, but still has this kind of driving plot of he just wants to get back to the barracks.
Yeah.
And, he just saw one of his mates get blown away. We start off with kind of a mini riot on the streets of Belfast while the cops, the Ulster Constabulary, are clearing out some row housing looking for weapons shipments to the IRA. And then it just goes horribly wrong. They're under equipped and understaffed, and he gets separated, and one of his friends, the guy, just walks up to him and takes him out with a pistol. It's pretty shocking, and that's kind of the fuse that sets everything in motion. And he's kind of a raw recruit. He's never seen anything like this before, and so you're kind of on his side from the get go. I think the fact that he's not a seasoned pro, that he's like completely out of his depth. And the whole time you're thinking, well, what would I do? And because sometimes there are moments in the film where you think he has a chance to get out, or that he could, if he just stayed put a little bit longer, but it's just not that simple. No. It's not just like crossing the street from one part of town to another.
And he doesn't know the town at all. So,
yeah, exactly. He's completely lost,
and he's finding unlikely sympathy from some people who are on the Republican side, but they know what would happen if this guy actually gets really hurt. So they are trying to protect him in whatever way they can. But there are people moving around the streets looking for him, and it was full of surprises. It really was.
Yeah, and we'll probably talk about this later. But of course, like in all films that involve the conflict in Northern Ireland, it's there are good guys and bad guys on either side. It's not like you just can't do a black and white, Irish struggles kind of film. That there's going to be, some people trying to do what's right and keep the peace, and other people that are just trying to stir up trouble and make it look like, do horrible things and then trying to pin it on the other side. And, and we see all of that in this film. And it's just, you just wonder how people made it through.
So this is our first chance at looking at the cinema of a nation, and we've kind of chosen a complicated one for our first time out. I think there, obviously this material, the historically fraught relationship between Ireland and Northern Ireland and the Troubles, as they are known, has been a source of a lot of great movies. But the cinema of Ireland isn't just about that. I mean, I tried to think about all the movies about the Troubles that I had seen, and I came up with a short list, including A Prayer for the Dying, Hidden Agenda, In the Name of the Father, The Crying Game, Bloody Sunday, Oma, Hunger, Shadow Dancer, 50 Dead Men Walking, and The Wind That Shakes the Barley, which is kind of a history of the Troubles.
Yeah, it's definitely the most historical of the bunch. Michael Collins, of course.
Right.
With Liam Neeson.
Yeah. But then there's a bunch of other movies from Ireland that I've enjoyed. Veronica Gerwin, Once, The Commitments, Waking the Divine, My Left Foot, The Guard, Hear My Song. I mean, these are movies that have nothing to do with those subjects. But I mean, as you were mentioning, the complexity of the Troubles are are certainly, and all the stories related, whether they're docudrama or just fictionalized accounts, certainly have drawn a lot of great filmmakers to tell those stories.
It's funny. I mean, I don't mean to generalize, because of course there's a bigger world out there, but it does, as those films you list, they're either about the conflict in some way or form, or they're or they're like a whimsical character study type comedy, or not necessarily a comedy, but you think of a film like Once, for example, a romantic musical film set in Dublin, that they're either like very character driven or kind of issue driven, and that seems to be kind of the way that they land. And I don't know if that has something to do, going back to the tradition, because before film, of course, I think film was probably a little late coming to Ireland than it was developing in England and in the U.S. So the stage, of course, Sean O'Casey, Brendan Behan, people like that, writing for the stage. I mean, that's kind of where Ireland first started to see itself. Its modern self reflected back at them was in the playhouses of Dublin and Belfast, and so that it comes out of that, I suppose. I think of something like The Plough and the Stars, which was turned into a pretty awful movie by John Ford.
Oh yes,
at some point in the 30s, but really captures the human drama behind the uprising in Dublin between the Irish and the British in the 1920s. So. There's a tradition before celluloid that this is kind of drawing on, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, a storytelling that's part of the culture.
Exactly, yeah.
And it totally makes sense.
And goes back even further. But of course, as modern times and modern politics intercede, that becomes part of the tradition.
Yeah. I found it interesting. One of the things that we found interesting about 71, to sort of go back to that for a second, is that when the character arrives in Belfast, both the Catholics and the Protestants call him the Brit. And he is known, therefore, by both sides, even though he is, in his head, is still in the UK, but it speaks to the identity of the people who are living there and his identity as an outsider, that he is the Brit. And even in Northern Ireland, they don't think of themselves as Brits necessarily.
No, it's just that it starts with the. Oh no, I'm thinking about another film. Sorry, I was thinking about our next film that we're going to talk. It starts with the Orange Man Parade.
Yes,
but that very divisive line that goes all the way snakes through Belfast and is such an annual object of tension and distress for a lot of people.
So Hidden Agenda from 1990, directed by Ken Loach, and I'm going to want to talk about one of his other movies later, but he's a British filmmaker with very left-leaning politics, to the point where many of his movies have been banned and not shown, and he's had a hell of a career. He's been making movies since, I think, the late 50s, and made a lot of them, but he certainly is a cause-oriented filmmaker, and Hidden Agenda is a cracking thriller, if I can say. I don't think it's based on any kind of real events, but it's set in the Troubles, and it's the basic story is two American lawyers, civil rights lawyers, are doing sort of a study of conditioned situations in Northern Ireland, when one of them is killed, played by Brad Dourif at the very beginning of the film, and his partner Francis McDormand is there trying to get to the truth of why he was shot. He was shot by British the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and he was in a car with a suspected terrorist, and she's trying to get to the truth with the help of a British investigator who's sent over to find out what's happened, played by Brian Cox. And there's a huge conspiracy behind all of it that relates to a tape that's gone missing, and senior members of the Conservative Party, and how they may have helped get Maggie Thatcher into power using legal means. And it's just it's got the background that we know well of this situation in Northern Ireland, and actually part of it's set in Dublin as well. But it's just a great, you could almost call it an espionage thriller.
In a lot of ways. I mean, it has some of that kind of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy kind of approach, where everybody's, the title is Hidden Agenda after all. Everybody's got their own motives, and it ties this murder that on the base of it seems like a local, Irish, Northern Ireland politics issue, with something being revealed that would be harmful to the British side, but then winding it into this example of how the Conservative Party kind of used Northern Ireland and the threat that it may or may not have. In some cases, it was a very real threat to people on the not on the mainland, but in Britain itself, and used that as a wedge to get into power. Much the same way that terrorism, after 9/11, gets used as a political tool. We see a lot of the same kind of terminology being used here, except instead of Al Qaeda, it's the IRA as this kind of boogeyman that's being touted about. It does give you some pretty good background on what things were like in the country at that time, and how there was so much more than just the one religion versus another, or Britain versus Catholic Ireland or whatever. That things went a lot deeper. Of course, we both, I remember our discussion after the film. We found it got a little didactic as it went along. We meet this shadowy figure from the IRA who basically turns into Mr. Exposition. He basically becomes Donald Sutherland in Oliver Stone's JFK, laying out the whole thing. And I saw this when it came out, and I don't remember it bothering me as much at the time because it was all new to me and all fairly fresh. And then I went to Ireland a few years after the film came out and got to see some of that for myself. But now this film hasn't aged so terribly well, but it's still worth seeing just because of the performances. Brian Cox as the British investigator who, doesn't want to just toe the line. He wants to really get to the truth of the matter, which of course becomes a puzzle wrapped up in an enigma and draped in mystery sauce. But but Frances McDormand is so wonderful. Years before Fargo catapulted her to fame, more or less. It's odd to see her so impossibly young in this film. And Brad Dourif, even though he gets gunned down pretty early in the film, it's always a treat to see him in a serious role and in a challenging role.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about all of that. I feel like Ken Loach, being this very issue-driven filmmaker, and he's kind of a humanist filmmaker. He's one of those guys who tends to shoot, wide sort of masters, and he doesn't tend to cut as much as some filmmakers. So he sort of lets his actors sort of move in and out of the frame in front of the camera, and it makes for more, I don't know, it just seems more, there's a sense of realism to it, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to the kind of genre that this is, which is a spy or thriller of a sort. But because the script is so compelling and his performers are so good, you never get, I was totally involved, completely gripped by it throughout. I totally agree as well that it feels, by the end, it's like, well, there's a lesson here that we all need to learn. And he's going to make sure that we get it.
I think just because we probably know more about the situation now than back then some of it can be a little heavy-handed, but because he does invest so much in the characters, and that's fairly late in the film that feeling comes along.
Yeah, I agree.
And it doesn't wrap up tidily because, of course, the whole situation didn't wrap up tidily. The peace talks with Sinn Féin, would sort of kick into gear in years after. I don't know if this film played a part or not, but it certainly opened a lot of eyes, outside of the UK. To what was happening there, and I think mission accomplished for Ken Loach.
For sure, and I think also I think the fact that the film was quite by more conservative elements of the critical community in the UK really didn't like it. In fact, I think someone called it an IRA support film or something,
like a propaganda film.
Yeah, which removed from the time it was made, I think makes it that one of the reasons to watch it, if it is that. I think that's a good discussion to have after the fact. So The Wind That Shakes the Barley won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 2006. So this is probably the Ken Loach film, aside from Hidden Agenda, that has gotten the most attention. And it goes back to the late teens, just after the First World War, and the what was the Irish the War of Independence, which I didn't know anything about. So this film was really interesting for me to see in terms of a historical document or historical recollection. Cillian Murphy plays Damien, who's a doctor and a socialist who isn't really interested in fighting the Brits, but his brother, played by Patrick Delaney, Teddy, is more the forthright leader type, and he kind of draws him in, and the two of them fight alongside a Liam Cunningham, who's who's an actor who I think Game of Thrones fan will know because he's Davos the pirate, missing the fingers in that show. But he's also a great actor, and this is a gorgeous looking film. Loach really that whole like wide shots with the green of the countryside. It's absolutely gorgeous, and I can't think of another film that better depicts how ideology can lead to war and bloodshed, because you got two brothers who are very passionate and they're organized and they're fighting off the Brits and the soldiers and they have to deal with the fact that some of the people they grew up with are collaborating with the Brits, and one young man, in fact, he gets executed for being a traitor, and it's just heartbreaking. It's an incredibly moving scene, and then eventually about the third act, the two brothers are split on their ideologies because one wants to accept. Teddy wants to accept the British Dominion deal, the treaty, and Damien, who sees people starving and as he treats them, out in the rural areas of Ireland, he wants nothing to do with that, and they wind up at odds with one another. It's just a startlingly effective way to tell the story, and very affecting too. I really love the movie.
Yeah, it does go way back to that time of that fight for independence, and when I was in Ireland, I kind of did the tour of some of the sites of when the pitched battles in the streets of Dublin at that time. The most famous event being the siege of the post office. A lot of the freedom fighters are I can't remember what the name of the cause, the Republicans maybe, but they were holed up in the post office and held the British off, and the bullet holes are still in the bricks of the post office on McConnell Street and over the McConnell Bridge, and saw some of and then I saw The Plough and the Stars, which is I saw that at the Abbey Theatre, the famous Dublin theatre, and that plays about that very event and the effect it had on a family in Dublin at the time. So I feel like I've not relived it, but certainly walked in the steps of some of the events that happened in this film, and it is a rich film, and certainly probably his most cinematic film for because it's a lot less. It's not as prosaic as some of his other films. He's taking time to dwell on some of the imagery, and of course because it's set in the past, the production design is a lot more involved. I don't think anybody came in wearing their street clothes.
Absolutely.
For this film, and Cillian Murphy is just phenomenal. I mean, I keep waiting for him to deliver another performance of this caliber, and I'm sure he still has it in him. I just haven't seen it from him in a while.
Yeah, he seems to be showing up in Christopher Nolan films in a supporting role more often than not lately. But he is so good in this, and it's really just a wonderful film. I felt just kind of very emotional at the end of it. So and I sort of revisited it just a little while ago preparing for this, and it was great. It was great to see it again. Yeah,
because it ties up there's the politics of it, there's the religion aspect. The film also gets into the fact that a lot of the land, the real estate, was owned by absentee British landlords, and the Irish basically didn't own their own country. It was all owned by Brits who'd been awarded parcels of land and then rented them out at exorbitant rates to farmers who were barely scraping out a living. Of course, which is what when the potato famine hit, 100 years before, that's the bottom fell out of everything. And the British took advantage of that to tighten their grip on the country. So here we're seeing the fallout of that is still affecting the country 100 years later. And actually, another film, I wasn't going to talk about it in detail, but there's a film called The Field by an Irish director named Jim Sheridan, who's you probably has worked a lot with Daniel Day-Lewis, My Left Foot being the most famous example. But The Field is a very human drama, very just takes place on a farm in Western Ireland.
Isn't it Richard Harris?
Richard Harris.
Yeah.
He's worked this land his whole life, and then the British, the widow who owns the land is going to sell it, and not to him, almost out of spite. And he's got his two sons, and he's just a force of nature in this film. And he would rather drive his animals over a cliff than give in to this spiteful landowner. So there's a lot of power in the land, as it were, in Ireland, and the filmmakers that can wring it out of it. It takes a lot of talent, but there's such a rich background to draw from. And Wind That Shakes the Barley. I mean, even the name, of the film comes from the land and the landscape.
Yeah, apparently a song, a folk song.
Yes.
So the last film of the sort of troubles covering that particular part of the history that I came to mind and I saw was Bloody Sunday from 2002. This is directed by Paul Greengrass, who has gone on to become well known as a Hollywood filmmaker, action filmmaker. He directed the second and third Bourne movies. He directed United 93 and also most recently Captain Phillips. Now this is a real docudrama. It tries to recreate the massacre in Derry in 1972, the Bloody Sunday massacre, shot in handheld docudrama style. Basically, the British military attacked civil rights protesters, partly organized by a Protestant Northern Irish politico Ivan Cooper, played by James Nesbitt. And it has an amazing grainy look. A lot of characters talking in crowds or from a distance or through doorways. Lots of that kind of feeling like it's all being shot on a fly, which is one of Greengrass's sort of trademarks, and he certainly brought that with him to this action cinema. But the thing that Greengrass does so well, and I wanted to mention this in watching it again and remembering what a talented filmmaker that guy is he creates. You never forget where you are in space. Like, he's always very good at doing the dynamics of where people are moving and how they're moving. You never feel sort of lost. I think a lot of people have borrowed that style as a shorthand for authenticity or grittiness or whatever the genre of film, and not many people can do it the way he does, and you really get a sense you're in the crowd with these people, and it's a shocking film because it really shows how there were a small group of people who were throwing rocks at the military, at the riot police, but there were a lot of peaceful protesters that day as well, and when things got out of control, the men with the machine guns shot a lot of innocent people. I think 14 people died that day, and many more were hurt. So it's pretty powerful stuff, and certainly important film to be considered with these group of movies.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that his visual style, which is sort of ordered chaos, goes back to before his bigger budget kind of Hollywood films. That was a trademark on something that's kind of on a smaller scale than something like Captain Phillips or those Bourne films. You must have to be incredibly organized, and logical kind of filmmaker to be able to do that and make it work. Because a lot of times it's just like, it's just an excuse to do kind of, Blender style editing of a lot of choppy shots that you hope will add up to something in post. But he seems to be very careful about how he assembles his shots and have them thematically make sense.
Yeah, and certainly it didn't hurt that his characters are pretty well defined. He chooses a certain amount of characters in the course of the setup, so that these ones are going to be important as you go through, sort of like one would in almost a disaster movie. But here, you get to see them as they run through the day, and of course some of them don't survive. And the people are enormously emotionally wounded and actually wounded by what happens that day, and I think it deftly describes an important day in history, and certainly at the time, a lot of those people who did the shooting that day had never came to justice. The independent look at what happened. The soldiers were all excused, and no one was prosecuted.
And 20 years later, after those events took place, when I was in Northern Ireland, I was basically told to stay out of Derry. Like, just don't even go near it.
Wow.
And, even though things weren't at the kind of heated kind of turmoil that they were at that time, it's just like, just don't. If somebody doesn't know which side you're on, you don't know what's going to happen. And
sure.
And I didn't want to get into that too much in this podcast, but it was an interesting time because it was right before the peace talks really started in earnest to try and to calm things down and bring peace to the area. But there was a palpable tension in places like Belfast and along the north coast and some of the towns that we went to, where every town would have a police station that just looked like an armed fortress right in the middle of these sort of bucolic seaside towns or whatever. But there'd be like this military presence, and you couldn't figure out why. Like, why does this have to happen? It doesn't make sense. But those ideologies run pretty deep, especially when they're tied into culture and religion and family and all that kind of stuff. And that's, of course, that's what makes these films so watchable, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it might not hurt to take a look back at kind of Irish imagery in film from the classic days. We've mostly been talking about films from the last few decades. And, but of course, Ireland had a much different image in film. You didn't see many films about the Troubles and the Revolution. I mean, there was The Informer with John Ford. John Ford seems to have he's an American director of Irish heritage who seems to have shaped the Irish image in film for like the first half of the century. And then reality kind of set in.
This is where you're getting into the territory that's new to me. So by all means, although we did watch a little bit of The Quiet Man the other day, which I did enjoy seeing John Wayne strutting around in the Irish countryside.
Yeah, and it was all filmed on location, which was kind of amazing for the time. A lot of the films that were set there were totally not filmed there. But John Ford, I guess, would use any excuse to get back over to Ireland because he started filming over there back in the silent days. But it's interesting how one guy basically, created this mythology of the Irish homeland, basically like 100 years after the waves of immigration to the 1800s. So he's basically knows his audience. He knows there's a huge audience for these films, not just Irish, but just it's just seeped into the American melting pot, as it were. And, it's part Blarney, there's a lot of fist fights and a lot of drinking, and it kind of reinforced all those stereotypes very artistically. They're great films. They're incredibly well made. I mean, we watched The Quiet Man, just a beautiful cinematography, and you've got iconic actors like John Wayne, of course, is a guy who made his fortune in the States and has come back to visit the homeland and falls in love with a young, beautiful Technicolor Colleen, played by Maureen O'Hara, who's got a fairly recalcitrant father who just wants to punch the crap out of John Wayne. And boy, does he ever in the big climax. But in one of the most famous, fist fight scenes in classic movie history. But so that was kind of what got ingrained in the cultural memory until the films about what was really going on started to seep into the consciousness a little while later. But it is interesting how, that is such a big part of classic Hollywood film, the Irish character, there's always that one Irish priest, maybe it's Bing Crosby or Father Flanagan or whatever. It doesn't really reflect on the reality of everything, or necessarily even the Irish experience in America. And we actually see in I think it's a Jim Sheridan film, In America, where we actually see how an Irish family fares. Yeah. Or Angela's Ashes, for that matter. Things were a lot different, but it seems like for people in Ireland, they were getting their own experience reflected back at them through these Hollywood films that were, for the most part, a load of Blarney, shall we say? I mean, if you want to go as far as a cartoon like Darby O'Gill and the Little People from Disney, the whole leprechaun mythology gets blown way out of proportion in that. But it's it's an interesting part of the history that we don't really see those films so much anymore. I get a kick out of them. I realize they're kind of goofy and don't necessarily represent what happened. But and there was another whole strain of films. Going back to the silent days, the Coens and the Kellys, and Abbey's Irish Rose, where you had these kind of films where a Jewish family and an Irish family would be connected by in a Romeo and Juliet scenario, although not as tragic, of course, but where like an Irish man falls in love with a Jewish girl or vice versa, and those were extremely popular because they were just pandering to the sort of the recent immigrant audience. Interesting. So diaspora in America, exactly, coming to see them. Yeah. And initially in the big audience for films were the upper class, the well established blue bloods, and the Plymouth Rock types, the Mayflower families. They kind of look down on the movies, and so the Edison, Griffith, all these, they quickly realized that the people of recent immigrants. And working class, the film was their entertainment. There was the theater for everyone else, but the film reflected this kind of working class audience, and that's kind of what shaped the stories that were told in the early days of film, including, Irish was a big part of that, and then it just had that lingering after effect through like John Ford films, even films that were set in the Old West, that would have that element of it. The bulk of the characters would be of that kind of heritage, and you'd have to put up with a drunken Irish party scene in the middle of She Wore a Yellow Ribbon or something like that. So, this stuff became pretty ingrained, and then you see, and then the fun thing is, when you watch The Simpsons, they make fun of that tradition, because obviously certain people grew up with that, probably because it was their parents' favorite movie and they had to watch it whenever it came on TV. So, it kind of lingers. So it's nice to see the intersection between the classic Hollywood view of Ireland and Irish culture and Irish American culture or whatever, and then the truth of the matter starts to take over in some of these films that we talked off the first half of them.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly whimsy is part of some of the films that aren't about those political issues that are still the new movies as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, you've got some of the films written down, the new generation of like whimsical or comedic films, the Commitments.
Yeah, Waking Ned Devine, sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's it's almost like, if you set it in Ireland, you got to have some wacky characters, because that's just the nature of the beast, apparently.
For sure. So I thought it would be good to suggest a double feature of some recent Irish filmmakers, and handily, there are two filmmaking brothers who are making great Irish movies right now. Martin McDonagh, who got his start as a playwright, is now a filmmaker, and his brother John Michael McDonagh. Now they are Irish bred or Irish born, but they actually raised in the UK, so they sort of dual citizenship, I discovered. But their characters and their stories are all very Irish. Even In Bruges, which is Martin McDonagh's 2008 feature film debut, and it's set actually in Belgium, in Bruges, in the town of Bruges, but it's about two hitmen, Brendan Gleeson and Colin Farrell, who are Irish, and they're laying low in the city as a result of Colin Farrell's character having shot someone he shouldn't have shot, and it's a wonderful mix of heavy, dark intensity. It's actually, there's elements of suicide and depression and absurdity, but there's also a lot of really wild, almost obnoxious humor. This is one of Farrell's best performances, and Brendan Gleeson is just wonderfully laid back, and he's just such a great presence in the film. I think some of it is for the more delicate constitution might be a little bit might be offended by some of the humor in the film, because it's quite raunchy in some ways, and then at the very end when Ralph Fiennes shows up, it gets pretty bloody, but it's such an unusual story, and it goes places you're never going to expect. So that's one I'd really recommend.
Well, there is a streak of black humor running through Irish literature and films, and I mean, you going back to Oscar Wilde, and then up through James Joyce, and my favorite example would be Spike Milligan from the Goons, who was of Irish descent, but it was actually born in India and then grew up in England. So it wasn't, but that Irish thing is just, from his dad, just is runs through him so fiercely, and wrote a few stories about Ireland. They're just they're like a combination of surreal, like almost James Joycean surreal dialogue and situations, but then this thick black humor that that's thicker than a pint of Guinness sort of thing.
Yeah.
and this fatalist kind of approach to life, and certainly a film like this brings a lot of that out in spades.
Absolutely, and it's a genre picture because there's hitmen, but it's got this wonderful cinematography because it really takes advantage of the scenery in Belgium, and so yeah, if you haven't seen that, I'd really recommend it, and it's a great one to watch with The Guard from 2011 by Martin McDonagh's brother John Michael McDonagh, and it's Brendan Gleeson in the lead. Now, in this film, he plays a crass drug taking, alcoholic, corrupt West Ireland cop. And this film's kind of a procedural. There's a murder and he's investigating it, but it's also in some ways a buddy cop movie because Don Cheadle shows up. He's an American FBI agent who's looking to track down a crew of drug traffickers. It's got a wonderful rambling quality with a lot of little interstitial characters, and you never really get a sense of where it's going. So in that regard, John Michael is a lot like Martin in his storytelling qualities. He's kind of rambling all over the place, but you really also feel a sense of warmth to these characters, even though they're pretty awful. And I really love both of these films. I think they would be great together.
It's the Guard is wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to seeing his follow-up Calvary with Brendan Gleeson back as a priest who's caught in a very life challenging ethical dilemma, and I haven't seen it yet. So
neither
I
have
don't
I.
want to go into it too much.
I'm looking forward to it myself. Yeah.
I think it played here for about a week and then it was gone. But the Guard just keeps you off guard basically the whole film because you don't know Brendan right off the bat. Brendan Gleeson is a guy who's not going to toe any kind of line and is not going to do anything predictable. You just don't know how seriously he's going to take his job or how far over the line he's going to go. Kind of like Bad Lieutenant Irish style, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not quite as extreme, but it goes on the edge there.
Yeah, there's more laughs, I would say.
Yeah, I'd say more. If Bad Lieutenant was a comedy,
there you go.
or less, or not quite as dark as that, but certainly Gleason's one of those guys who can, just be in your face and intimidating and one moment and hilarious the next, and he's one of those actors that. He's a delight anytime you see him, even in the Harry Potter movies. He's one of those guys that just takes hold of the screen.
Yeah, for sure. So Hear My Song is a movie I really wanted to mention, and I know that this is a bit of a dodgy inclusion in the cinema of Ireland, and that's because it's officially a British movie, but a chunk of it, like the second act, takes place in Ireland, and it's about an actual Irish tenor. This guy, Joseph Locke, was an actual guy, and this is a sort of a fantasy based around actual facts. He was famous in the 50s as a singer in the UK, but he was he had sort of tax evasion. He hadn't paid his taxes, so he escaped prosecution by sailing over to his homeland of Ireland and just kind of living there for many years. And the story is Adrian Dunbar plays a Liverpool nightclub promoter, Mickey O'Neill, in the late 70s, who hatches a plan to bring Locke back to the UK for a comeback performance because he's going to lose his nightclub if he doesn't do something spectacular. Now, what Dunbar does is he goes over to Ireland and he gets his friend, played by James Nesbitt, to try to track down Locke. Locke played by Ned Beatty. Now, it also turns out that Locke, when he was back in the 50s, had a romance with a British woman whose name was Kathleen. Take me home, Kathleen, and her daughter Nancy, played by Tara Fitzgerald, another cast member of Game of Thrones, incidentally. She is in a relationship with Dunbar, and also another great character actor, David McCallum of Man from U.N.C.L.E. is in it.
Oh, of course.
He plays the British cop who's on the hunt for Locke, the Locke who got away from him, and he's always wanted to lock him up. So this is a really charming little movie, and frustratingly, it's not available on DVD, and you can still find it on VHS and apparently on Laserdisc.
Yes, I looked it up just during the break. It's you can get a copy on Laserdisc for $1.06.
There you go.
You're so inclined.
But this is a wonderful little movie, and it does have some of that whimsy, and it really comes. It's partly the music, which is really, really great, but it's going over to Ireland and this whole midsection where they get lost. At one point, Dunbar and his buddy and Nesbitt are in a field, and they come across an enormous well, and they start throwing things into the well just to see how far it is till they hear the splash. They get more and more. Eventually, they throw a big log down, but then it's attached to a chain to a cow, and the cow is running towards the well. Anyway, it has a brief venture into farce that I really adored before it goes back to the sort of love affair and the singing and of course Locke's triumphant return to the stage of Liverpool. And I really, if you can track it down, it's a wonderful film. 1991. It's called Hear My Song.
I saw this when it came out, probably at the late lamented Wormwood's Dog and Monkey Cinema, and here in Halifax. And I just remember loving the film, and I hadn't seen a lot of Irish films or Irish set films at that point. I think I had seen Hidden Agenda not too long before that, so it was nice to see the more whimsical side of that. And Ned Beatty is such a wonderful actor, and it's so rare that you get to see him in a role like this, where he kind of gets to take over the storyline. Usually most people remember him from Deliverance, but usually he's got a string of these kind of secondary character roles that he excelled at. But he really takes the bull by the horns before it goes down the well, sort of in this film. And I'll do like those kind of Shaggy Dog diversions. My strongest image is of him singing he's on a fishing boat as they're taking him. I can't remember if they're taking him to Liverpool or back to Ireland on this thing, but and it wasn't, after the film I kind of looked up the Locke and he was a huge star. But there was this whole thing about Irish tenors that were just, there were so many of them that were just such big names. John McCormack is another one of that generation, who sang all Danny Boy and I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen, and also like some of the hymns and that kind of thing. And it was just this huge pop music phenomenon that is, for the most part, pretty forgotten now. We have some sort of latter day variations on the Irish tenor, but it wasn't like a mainstream icon the way it was then. In fact, John McCormack starred in at least one film for Fox back in the day. He was not a good actor, so it was a pretty short-lived film career. But it was, they were big enough that someone would have faith that they could carry a major motion picture. Sure. And that this captures that moment so well when anybody hearing a high Irish tenor would just, melt in the aisles kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, that's the impression I got. And I do nothing about Locke or about that scene, but having seen the film, I did my own little research as well and found all these wonderful songs that he recorded back in the day, as they say.
I think it's just because those kind of voices carried so well on the old 78s, that there was such power. It's like Al Jolson, because he had such a voice that would cut through fog like that it recorded well to the early cylinders and then 78s, even before electronic recording. So, that's part of the reason why they were so popular, just because they came across so well on disc. But
for sure,
definitely a big phenomenon on stage and on record.
So just to finalize our trip to the Emerald Isle here, Stephen, we've in the past talked about our favorite movie in a genre that we're talking about, but I actually was wondering whether or not there was a favorite Irish director that you would recommend to people.
Well, I mentioned The Field earlier in the film, and that director, Jim Sheridan, and I'm going to have to go with Jim. He's iconic filmmaker. Hasn't really dwelt so much on Irish stories in a while. I think In America in 2002. And it was all set in America about an Irish family that moves to the States and searching for better things. That was kind of like the last time he really delved into that kind of story. But, so many legendary, Oscar-winning My Left Foot, the story of Christy Brown, with Daniel Day-Lewis, with whom he's made 3 films. And In the Name of the Father is, about... an IRA operative in his time in prison, and The Boxer about a guy getting out of jail and getting into fighting in the ring as opposed to fighting in the streets. When he's dealing with kind of the nitty gritty of everyday life, has a real feel for it, and for characters that are for underdog kind of characters. Sure. Like Richard Harris in The Field, and there's not a lot of humor in those films, but I do really feel like I've seen something, pretty human and pretty moving by the time they're done. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. And of course, his relationship with Daniel Day-Lewis, who is not only probably the greatest actor ever to come out of Ireland, but maybe one of the greatest actors that's ever been, has got to be, that's a whole huge part of that, right? Certain directors have a connection with a powerful performer, and that they bring out the best in each other.
Yeah, I'd love to see them work together again. Obviously, My Left Foot was a huge turning point Daniel Day-Lewis. I mean, that was the film that made him a household name. I'm pretty sure my memory of Oscar history is pretty dim. Trying to recall these things off the top of my head, but I believe he won the Oscar for that performance.
He did. He came up and he said, "You've made for a great night in Dublin." I think that was his first line.
Exactly. And at the end of the film, they show he gets wheeled up a hill at the end of the film, and I actually climbed that hill outside of Dublin. I had to go climb the hill from the end of the film.
There you go.
And it's always nice to revisit those moments in history. So I imagine at some point they'll probably work together again.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, Day-Lewis picks his projects carefully these days. Doesn't work that often, but when he does, it's a great thing. My favorite Irish director I thought about was Neil Jordan, someone who has managed to move in and out of Irish stories, in and out of Hollywood. Certainly hasn't, all his films haven't been great, but the ones where he has really made his mark include The Company of Wolves. Mona Lisa is probably my favorite film of his from 1986, about Bob Hoskins driving a prostitute around London as a limo driver, and it's just a wonderful, sad little love story and a crime drama too.
Great Michael Caine performance.
And The Crying Game, which is another film about the Troubles, and famously about someone little gender issues going on there, which surprised a lot of people in the audience. I remember when that film came out. But Jordan's also responsible for films like The End of the Affair, a great south of France set sort of heist movie with Nick Nolte called The Good Thief, and Byzantium from last year, which was a vampire movie that I don't know a lot of people saw. It only came out in DVD here, but it's a wonderful little gothic horror, and in an old-fashioned kind of way that I really enjoyed. His actual second vampire movie, if you think about the Interview with the Vampire, not one of my favorite of his, but he keeps coming back and making interesting choices with his career. And he's a wonderful filmmaker. So a tip of the hat to Neil Jordan. Yeah,
I haven't seen Byzantium, and like you mentioned, he did Interview with the Vampire, and of course Company of Wolves, which was this great deconstruction of the werewolf myth by tying it into Little Red Riding Hood. One of the highlights is you get to see Angela Lansbury's head get knocked off her body and it goes sent sailing across a room. That's not bad for an early film to have that kind of image stuck in your head, but so it's nice to see him back in horror territory, because of course often serious filmmakers don't make genre pictures, and the Good Thief, that's a film I went into kind of dreading, because it's actually kind of a loose remake of a French classic called Bob le Flambeur.
Yeah, sure.
And it turned out to be different enough. The framework was similar. Nick Nolte kind of playing it down at his heels, gambler who gets roped into this heist that goes horribly wrong. But aside from that, different approach to the story, a different kind of tone. Mm-hmm. And Nolte is, it's one of his best performances.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I
haven't seen anything like that out of him since. So, clearly he's got some real talent. Over the years, just the for him, I think the story is the thing that his ability to focus on that is pretty key.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed our cinematic trip to the old sod. If you enjoyed the show, you can contact us on Twitter at LensMeYourEars, all one word, or search for Lends Me Your Ears on Facebook.
We're on Stitcher, and you can rate and review us on iTunes, and if you do, we'll give you a shout-out in a future episode. Our email is lensmeyourears@gmail.com. I'm Carsten Knox, and my Twitter is @Carsten Knox.
And I'm Stephen Cook, and my Twitter is @CH_SCOOKE. Thanks for listening, and may you be in heaven an hour before the devil knows you're dead.
Lends Me Your Ears is hosted by Stephen Cook and Carsten Knox, and is produced in Halifax, Nova Scotia at Village Sound for the Village Soundcast Network. Lends Me Your Ears is engineered by Luke Badio and is produced by Dave Anderson and Jason Michael McIsaac. All music courtesy of Gypsophilia. Check out all of their amazing music, tour dates, and so much more at gypsophilia.org. Discover more great shows on the Village Soundcast Network by going to villagesoundcast.com. We can also be found on Twitter at @VSoundcast and on Facebook by searching the Village Soundcast Network. Rate and review us on iTunes and you'll get a shout-out on an upcoming show. Send feedback to lensmeyourearspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
This was a Village Soundcast Network original production.
Came in at £5. Is that a baby or a turkey?
Turkey.